Silver on the Tree by Susan Cooper. Part 3, The Lost Land, Chapter 13, The Merry Llwyd. They watched the troop of riders, miniature in the distance, moving fast across the fields. Will's horse tossed its head suddenly, snuffling the air, and began to quicken its pace. Bran came up level with him. They're doing a good lick trying to get to the castle before we do? I suppose so. Shall we race? I don't know. Will looked down at his restless mount. The horses want to. Bran was sitting poised in the saddle, his pale face alert. He smiled. Think you can stay on? Will laughed, a sudden wild exhilaration seizing him. Just watch! He gave no more than a flick of the reins before the horse was off, leaping out, galloping eagerly along the hard sandy track. Bran was beside him, leaning forward, white hair flying, yelling with delight. On and on they went, past stretches of ripening oats and wheat, past fields where placid cattle grazed, some the familiar black, but many pure white. The horses ran smoothly, confidently in the distance. The riders of the dark raced parallel, then, after a while, disappeared behind the far edge of the wood, which lay in the center of the country, between the city and the castle and the lost land. Will had assumed that their own road, too, would skirt this wood, on the nearer side, but when he raised his head out of the whirl of riding, he found that they had not turned. Instead, the trees seemed to be reaching out around them, cutting off their view of the shining glass tower. He and Bran were galloping straight toward the wood, and the wood was growing, rising before them, far darker and more dense than it had seemed before. The horses began to slow their pace. Come on! Bran twitched his reins impatiently. They know best, Will said. I don't like the looks of that wood. Bran glanced up, flinching at the size of the dark mass looming ahead. They aren't stopping, though. Why didn't they go around it? I suppose they have to go where the track goes, and I didn't notice where it was going. Should have done. We both should have done. Oh, well. The horses were walking again now. Bran pushed one arm across his forehead. Lord, it's hot. The sun's still high. The woodland was sparse and open at first, leafy with bracken and undergrowth, still bright through the dappling shade. The road, though narrowed to a track, wound through the trees, clear and sandy, but gradually it became less distinct, with patches of grass growing in the sand and arms of creeping plants reaching across. And now the air was cool as the wind grew deeper. The horses stepped warily in single file. Few birds sang here. Will and Bran began to be conscious of the silence. The trees were larger and thicker. The wood went on and on. Will tried, for as long as he could, to ignore the feeling drifting insidiously into his mind as the light grew dim and the trees more dominant, but he knew he was afraid. There was nothing to be heard now but the soft rise and fall of the horses' feet. The path they trod was completely overgrown, yet still visible, covered, as if to mark it from its surroundings, by a mat of some small creeping weed with dark green leaves. Somewhere among the trees, edging the path ahead, a bird whirred abruptly away. The horses checked nervously. They're as scared as I am, Will said, trying to brighten his voice. A branch rustled nearby in the wood, and he jumped. Bran looked round in the gloom. He said uneasily, Should we go back? But as if in answer, the horses began walking steadily forward again. Will stroked the light mane on the neck before him. The horse's ears were laid back flat, but still he went doggedly on. Perhaps it's just a barrier, he said suddenly. Like the maze. Perhaps they know there's not really anything to be scared of. Some unseen creature rose in the underbrush beside the path and went crashing off through the still trees and the green seas of fern all around. Will and Bran gasped, but this time the horses walked on unheeding. The trees interlaced overhead. Will rode with his teeth clenched, fighting off panic, comforted only by the steady swaying of his tall horse. The air was cool and damp. They crossed a small sluggish stream half buried in fern. Then almost imperceptibly the horse's pace began to quicken. Light began to filter through the branches overhead once more. Sand appeared between the tight-woven green leaves of the matted path. We're coming out, Bran said in a half-whisper, high with relief. You were right. The horses knew it was just spookiness. We're coming out. The horses began to trot. An easy swinging motion. They tossed their heads, as if from a sense of release. Will felt the pounding of his heart slide back to normal. He sat up straighter, ashamed of his fear, and looked up at the thinning trees. Blue sky again, look! Oh, what a difference! So they were both relaxed in the saddle, holding loose reins, looking up unprepared, when suddenly one of the horses gave a high, terrified whinny, and both shied, rearing as something large and loud rushed at them out of the trees. And before they knew it, Will and Bran were jerking backwards, clutching wildly for rein or saddle bow, tumbling helplessly to the ground. The two golden horses bolted in panic across the rough, sedgy pasture, stretched away from the wood. Will had a quick glimpse of the thing that was chasing them. He cried out in horror and disbelief. "No!" Bran gave a croaking shout without words, and they stumbled up and fled unthinking over the fields in the heat of the summer sunshine. Will felt cold. His head sang. He wanted to be sick. He was too frightened even to think of fear. It was the skeleton of a giant horse, staring with the blind eye sockets of a skull, running and leaping and prancing on legs of bone, driven by ghostly muscles long rotted away. It caught them almost at once. Faster than any living horse, it galloped without any sound. Silently it overtook them, head turned, grinning in impossible horror. The white bones of its great rib cage glittered in the sun. It tossed its dreadful silent head, and red ribbons dangled and fluttered like long banners from its grinning lower jaw. The creature was playing with them, driving them this way and that, as a kitten plays with a beetle. It leapt to and fro before them, then stopped in its tracks, hooves skidding in the sandy soil. Then, with the leering skull thrust out, jaws wide open, it charged at them in terrible silence, and was suddenly past them, behind them, waiting again, swinging round wildly. Bran stumbled and fell. The skull tossed on the spine that was a neck. The teeth glittered. The red ribbons danced around a strange broken stump in the center of the bony forehead. In the same soundless menace, it stood watching them out of the blind skull, hoof and bone pawing the ground. Will swallowed. "You all right? Get up." Bran was sitting up, blinking wide, tawny eyes. His glasses were gone. "The Merry Llwyd," he whispered. "The Merry Llwyd." He was staring at the thing as if bewitched. "Get up! Quick!" Will had glimpsed a refuge nearby. In panic, he dragged Bran to his feet. The spectre began to circle them, slowly, silently. "Over here! Come on!" It was a building he saw, the strangest of buildings, a small, low house made of blocks of gray stone, with a once thatched roof covered in turf and straggling grass and great swaths of branches blossoming white. A hawthorn tree was growing there from the ancient roof, a low tree not much bigger than a bush. Bran stood transfixed, his eyes on the skeleton. "The Merry Llwyd," he whispered again. "Close your eyes," Will said fiercely. He thrust his hand in front of Bran's face to cut off the sight of the monstrous horse, and in the same moment the right words came to him. "Quick, think, what did the lady say?" "The lady?" Bran said dully, but his head turned. "What did the lady say to Jane? Think." "To Jane?" Bran's face began to change. "To tell us a white bone will prevent you, and a flying May tree will save you. Look at it! Look at it!" Will turned him to the stone house with the blossoming white tree growing from its roof. The thing stalking them wheeled closer, closer. With a sound like a sob, Bran stumbled forward. Will pushed him in through the door and slammed it shut behind them. He stood leaning against it, gasping for breath. There was a prickling silence outside. Bran looked down at his hands. He was still clutching the saddlebag from his vanished horse, as if it were a lifebelt. Dropping it to the floor, he rubbed his fingers and looked at Will. "Sorry." But Will was not listening. He had crossed the one small window that let in a dim, shadowy light through the chunky stone wall. A broken shutter hung from the window frame. There was no glass. Will's face was pale. Bran saw fear in it. Will said huskily, "Can you look?" "I'm all right now." Bran came to stand beside him, and when he looked through the window, he clutched Will's arm without knowing it, so hard that the fingertips dug deep in and afterwards left a mark behind. the great white skeleton of the horned horse, dead and yet alive, was wheeling to and fro in front of the cottage, to and fro, to and fro. Its 4 bony legs danced beneath the curving, empty white strips of the rib cage and the flattened arcs of the hip blades. The long, bare-boned skull was jerking up and down in a dreadful dead frenzy, faster and faster. Each time it faced the cottage, it dropped its forehead like a charging bull and paused for an instant before turning restlessly away and wheeling to and fro once more. Will whispered, "It's going to run at us, charge at the door. What can we do?" "Block the door. Would that stop it?" "Not a hope." "Is there anything you can do, make happen? We're in the lost land." And the monstrous thing out there in the sunshine made one last great curving turn before it would charge at the door to burst into their destruction. Wheeling deliberately close to the window of the house, out of its hollow-eyed skull the creature laughed dreadfully, soundlessly in at them for a second. It was the last second. As the thing passed so close, a long flurry-like snow came down past the window from above, a fluttering, flickering cloud of white flakes falling on the apparition. All the petals of the hawthorn tree falling dropped in a long, soft shower, and the horse that was the skeleton of the horse collapsed, as if the strings had been cut from a marionette and fell apart. Every bone fell from every other bone, clattering down to the ground, rattling as clear now as all had been silent before, and nothing was left but a heap of white bones, gleaming in the sun, bleached long dead with faded red ribbons, dripping from the long grinning skull that lay askew on top of the pile. Bran let out a long, soft breath, his hands going up to cover his eyes. He swung aside and slumped gently down to the floor. So it was only Will, standing wide-eyed in wonder beside the window, who saw the flurry of white petals rise again, fluttering alive like a great crowd of feathery, white-plumed moths he had seen before somewhere, and rise, flickering into the sky and out of sight far away. Will turned unsteadily, uncertain whether to trust his knees. He stood gazing at the dim-lit room. It was a little while before he properly saw anything, but his churning senses began to calm again. He found he was looking at the door, an ancient door of rotting, battered wood, which would have withstood no impact of any kind at all. He could see some words written over it, with the faint glimmer of gold in them. There was not enough light to read what they said. Will went shakily across and pushed open the door. Brightness came in. Bran said slowly behind him, reading, "I am the shield for every head." "And it's written inside where we couldn't see it," Will said, stepping back to peer up at the words. "So we might never have dared to come in if it hadn't been for what the lady said." Bran was sitting, arms over his knees, white head drooping. "Do that thing." "Don't talk about it," Will said, with a shiver went over him like a cold breeze, and he remembered something. "But Bran, what was that name you called it when it had you hypnotized? You called it something in Welsh." "Ah," Bran said, "the original nightmare, that thing. There is an old Christmas custom in South Wales of something called the Llwyd, the grey mare. A procession goes through the streets, and a man dressed up in a white sheet carries the skull of a horse stuck up on a pole. He can make its jaws open and shut and pretend to bite people. And one Christmas, when I was very small, the Rowlands took us down there visiting, my da and me, and I saw the Llwyd, and it frightened the lights out of me. Terrible screaming nightmares for weeks." He looked up at Will with a weak smile. "If anyone had really wanted to put me out of my head, they couldn't have chosen a better way." And we will pause there.